Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a chapter called When Fathers Fail. Now this piece lays out a very specific theological argument about the family and society, and it's pretty provocative. So let's break down exactly what it has to say.
The entire source that we're looking at today really hinges on this one single question. The author proposes that there are direct and pretty severe consequences when fathers don't fulfill what they see as their primary duties. We're going to walk through their argument step by step.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the author's ideal for a father's role. Then we'll get into this idea of a national curse that they claim is the result of that failure. After that, we'll look at the specific diagnosis for why this is all happening, and finally, we'll explore the solutions offered, both for individuals and for the church as a whole.
Okay, let's get into our first section. Before we can really grasp the author's idea of failure, we first have to understand their definition of success. So here's the framework they lay out for what a father should be. And just so we're all on the same page, everything we're about to talk about comes directly from this source text. Our job here isn't to agree or disagree with it, but simply to explain the argument it's making on its own terms.
So, according to the source, a father's job is built on these three specific roles. First, as a priest, he's meant to intercede for his family. Second, as a prophet, he teaches them about God. And third, as a king, he leads the home in a righteous way. For the author, this three-part framework is the absolute foundation for everything else they're about to argue.
Okay, so with that ideal vision in place, the author then makes a sharp pivot to what they see as our modern reality, a widespread crisis. And they don't mince words. They frame this problem in some really stark biblical terms.
Believe it or not, the author's entire argument really orbits around this single verse from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. They argue this isn't just some piece of ancient history, they see it as a living prophecy, a curse that is actively playing out in families today.
And here is the author's central claim. When we see children becoming estranged from their parents, it's not just a sad social trend. In their view, what we're actually witnessing is the direct fulfillment of this ancient curse right here in the modern world.
Now, it's really important to understand what the author means by captivity. They're not talking about a literal physical kidnapping. For them, it's a state of being enslaved to all sorts of destructive forces they see as just as real and dangerous as a foreign invasion.
And to make this really concrete, this slide gives us some of the author's specific examples of captivity. They point to things like drug addiction, cults, or what they call satanic captivity, and illicit sex. For them, these aren't separate issues. They're all symptoms of children being enslaved, drawing a direct line back to that biblical curse.
So what's the root of all this? Well, according to the text, the cause is a persistent rejection of God's righteous requirements. And they're very specific about where this rejection is happening, in the home and family, which they see as the main battlefield.
So now, in section 3, the author drills down even deeper. They actually turn to the prophet Malachi to diagnose exactly why this failure within the family is happening to begin with.
The author pulls this passage from Hosea to draw a really clear cause and effect line. The argument is startlingly direct. When parents reject or forget God's law, God in turn will forget their children.
And see how this connects right back to that first role we talked about? The author argues that when a father fails in his priestly duty, that is, the responsibility to know and teach religious texts, that specific failure is what triggers the consequences described back in Hosea.
Then, the author adds another layer to their diagnosis, this time turning to the book of Malachi. And here, the focus shifts to the covenant between a husband and wife. Unfaithfulness in marriage is identified as another core reason for the breakdown.
The message the author pulls from Malachi can basically be summed up like this. Being outwardly religious doesn't make up for breaking faith at home. The central claim here is that how you treat your spouse is paramount, and no amount of public piety can cover up for a private failure in the marriage.
Okay, well, after laying out the problem and its causes in pretty stark detail, the source shifts gears. It goes from diagnosis to prescription, and it proposes a path to fix all this that starts with the individual father.
This verse, which is actually the very last one in the Old Testament, is presented by the author as the key to reversing the entire curse. This idea of turning hearts isn't just a suggestion. It's positioned as the one and only antidote.
And this is a really crucial point for the author's solution. The responsibility to act first falls squarely on the fathers. The text is clear that they can't wait for their kids to change.
The fathers themselves must initiate the reconciliation by turning their own hearts toward their children.
But the solution isn't just a personal one. In this final section, the author argues that the wider religious community, the church, has a massive institutional responsibility to step up and address this crisis as well.
So here, the author really zooms out. The argument is that the Christian family isn't just supposed to be a private little unit. It's meant to be a public demonstration, a living, breathing picture of these core theological ideas for the rest of the world to see.
The text then points to this verse from the book of James to define what it considers true religion. And you'll notice the focus is entirely on action, tangible, practical care for the most vulnerable people in society, specifically orphans and widows.
And using that definition as a benchmark, the author delivers a pretty sharp critique. They state their personal conclusion, based on their experience, that the modern Western church is delinquent, that it's failing in what should be one of its most basic primary duties.
So after laying out this whole argument, the problem, the cause, the solutions, the author doesn't really give us a neat little summary. Instead, they end with this direct challenge. It's a provocative question aimed not just at individual fathers, but at the entire institution of the church itself, leaving the reader to decide the answer.